word heart. family came to the agreement that they gave us a celebrate just as they were at the monument. Now I give the floor to Reverend Fritz Morgensen. You're going to Madison, and he comes from the church in Keflavík. Reverend.
Each individual lives located every single person. This is the story of my experience. Spouses, children, grandchildren, etc. Most of us know the feeling in the heart when it strikes us with excitement and anticipation. The feeling of having a lot of problem. It comes to life. Life is so vivid and great, filled with joy, filled with glory, and filled with love. In the Old Testament it says that there is time for everything. Time to love. It's time to cry. It's time to dance. And it's time to go. Everything has its time. It's time to live, and it's time to die. Everything that happens under the heaven has its time. And the life of humans accommodates all that is happening, and is truly a part of eternity. At the same time, our lives are so weak and vulnerable, the heartbeat and the breath, that we do not even control ourselves, manage to keep us alive. It's a grace and gift from God that we can live day by day, one moment, every given time. It's safe to say we do not know what our future holds and what destiny God gives us. We do not know a fact our life can have on the future. Franklin Andrews was the head of all United States forces in Europe when his plane crashed at Reykjanes on the 3rd of May in 1942. On the aircraft were 14 other senior men in the military when the plane flew into bad weather and hit the mountain Keflavík in Reykjanes and shattered. We do not know our destiny, and we do not know what role God gives us in our lives. However, it can be said that the accident on the 3rd of May in 1943 had a major impact on the history of the world. Dwight Eisenhower was appointed as the head of the military instead of General Andrews. His story is known as he was a war hero who had a major impact on the progress of the war, and later he became the President of the United States of America. Dear God, we thank you for General Andrews and all the good men that died in the cross with him. We thank you for what they gave us. What they gave to the world. We pray that God Almighty will bless the memory of General Andrews and all those who died in the accident on the 3rd of May, 1950. The grace of Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all.
We heard at the beginning beautiful sounds, music from the band, Winds Aloft band. We will hear music from them now. Winds Aloft, please. This beautiful music was presented by Winterloft, the United States Air Force in Europe band. The artists they are. Now the first speaker of the day is a good friend, and we're very grateful to him for pressing into his very tight schedule this ceremony here. He came from Chicago this morning, but is giving himself the time to stay here with us in the memory of those who lost their lives at Fagradalsfjall 75 years ago. It's my privilege to give the floor now to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Guðlaugur Þór Þórðarson. Guðlaugur, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hjálmar. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, family members of the Hot Stuff passengers and crew. Earlier today, we gathered at the scene of the tragic plane crash which claimed the life of 14 people. It was a heartfelt moment for all of us. It reminded us of the price we sometimes need to pay for freedom. Amongst those who lost their lives in this day 75 years ago was Lieutenant General Frank M. Andrews, the highest-ranking Allied officer to die in the line of duty that time in the war. At the time of his death, he was the commanding general of the United States Forces for European Theater of Operations. In February 1943, 3 months before his death, he assumed command of all US forces in Europe, succeeding General Dwight D. Eisenhower when the latter was named Allied Commander of the North African Theater of Operations. There are many who believe that Lieutenant General Andrews was destined for greater role as a military leader in the war and possibly as a civilian leader after the war. That we never will know. His was an unfinished life, but so full of purpose nevertheless. An old poem from Hávamál, the ancient Viking literature, comes to mind. It goes like this in English translation. Cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself die. One thing know that never dies, the fame of a dead man's deeds. Dear guests, in May of 1943, the war was raging, and although the tide had shifted and the Allied gained the upper hand, victory was far from certain. Before victory was achieved, so many lives were lost. Without those sacrifices, freedom and democracy would not have prevailed over tyranny. I am honored to be here today and particularly thankful to the family members of the Hot Stuff's passengers and crew for coming to Iceland to participate in this ceremony. I would also like to emphasize at this moment how important the friendship and cooperation between our two countries has been. Ever since the American forces arrived here more than 75 years ago. We have a very special relationship based on common values and respect for freedom and democracy. And it is therefore so appropriate that we gather here today in the memory of great people who served their country and made the ultimate sacrifice. We stand here in gratitude. We owe those who gave their lives so much. Let us remember them now and forever. Fallen, but not forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Guðlaugur Þórðarson. In preparing a day like this, there are thousands, millions of things that have to be done. A lot of people have supported that, and not least the staff from the U.S. Embassy here in Iceland under the leadership of Keflavík. How was the pronunciation? Yeah. Thank you. Ms. Jill Esposito. I welcome you here to the
Thank you, Hjalmar. Lieutenant General Clark, visitors from the United States Air Force Europe, Ambassador Arriaga, members of the Diplomatic Corps, family and friends of the Hot Stuff B-24 crew. On behalf of the United States government, it's my great honor to join you for this momentous event, recognizing the sacrifices for those who have gone before us. As we gather to remember the souls who perished on May 3rd, 1943, it's natural to feel a sense of loss. We think about lives not lived, dreams not pursued, and loved ones left behind. The crew and passengers on the B-24 Hot Stuff gave the ultimate sacrifice in the fight against evil and to preserve our liberty in the United States, Iceland, and throughout the world. The Hot Stuff crew had spent the previous months flying dangerous missions in the European theater, not knowing if that flight might be their last. In fact, as you heard, the Hot Stuff was the first heavy bomber to complete 25 combat missions in Europe during World War II. Needless to say, in addition to a sense of loss, we feel a sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the courage, the honor, and the commitment to something greater than themselves that these men displayed. Sacrifices of these men 75 years ago was near to the beginning of the close partnership that the United States and Iceland have forged over these many years. Shortly after the war, the US and Iceland became founding members of NATO. We've stood shoulder to shoulder since then, and I think those bonds are obvious as we see in the participation of the government of Iceland and our friends from Iceland at this memorial ceremony. As you know, the Hot Stuff Monument would not have been possible without Icelandic support. One example of the friendship in a common cause is the dedication of today's monument. I want to express my gratitude to Jim Lux and Dodie and Ole Martinson for the years of effort to make this monument a reality, and also to our former ambassador, Luis Arriaga, who championed this project as well. Thank you to all of you. After World War II, the U.S.-Iceland friendship continued very visibly through the years that the U.S. military operated its base here in Keflavík. When the base was established in 1951, the mission was clear, the battle lines well-defined. These days, the world feels more complicated. Threats come in the form of nerve agent attacks in the United Kingdom, horrific chemical weapons use in Syria, terrorists driving a truck into a crowd in Sweden, or a cyber attack in Estonia. State and non-state actors disregard international law and work to undermine democracy and the NATO alliance. In the face of these threats, it is all the more important today that we maintain the bonds of friendships and the common values that unite us. I mentioned General Eisenhower. We know how important the tragic events in May 3rd, 1943 were to his own life trajectory. And when he addressed the NATO Council, he talked about security this way. We do not keep security establishments merely to defend property or territory or rights abroad or at seas. We keep security forces to defend a way of life. As we think about that way of life today, we are reminded that we could not enjoy it without the sacrifices of those who, like the Hot Stuff crew, gave their lives to defend it. Because of the efforts of many of you here today, we can now see the visible reminder of their sacrifice and of our lifelong partnership in the Hot Stuff Monument. It will give countless visitors a place to think, pause, and reflect. Each time I see that monument, perhaps on my way to the Blue Lagoon, it will give me the inspiration to keep working so that Iceland, the United States, and all of our allies can maintain our freedom and our way of life. And together, we remain committed to adapting to the face of security challenges in the 21st century as friends and allies. Iceland and the United States have a future to write together. Whatever comes next, I'm confident that our partnership will continue to adapt to advance our mutual goals of peace and prosperity for all. I thank all of you again for coming here today and for honoring the B-24 crew, Hot Stuff. I'd like to give the final word once again to General Eisenhower, who I am confident never lost sight of the sacrifices made by those lost here on that mountain. He liked to say that because he was a warrior, he knew how essential it was to preserve the peace, and that the building of such a peace is a bold and solemn purpose. To proclaim it is easy, to serve it will be hard, and to attain it, we must be aware of its full meaning and ready to pay its full price. We salute the crew of the Hot Stuff for paying the full price and making the ultimate sacrifice in the name of peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill, for those beautiful words. I think we should give a bit stronger applause to the staff of the United States Embassy in Keflavík, or Reykjavik, for doing all this. Next on stage is Lieutenant General Richard Clark, Commander of the 3rd Air Force, United States Air Force in Europe. Lieutenant General, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the warm introduction, and Chargé d'Affaires, Jill Esposito, thank you for being here, as well as Ambassador Arriaga, and Commander Osgrimsson, thank you for being here as well. You and your team have been gracious hosts, and I appreciate all that you've done. Other distinguished guests, families, friends, thank you all, and on behalf of General Todd Walters, my boss, the Commander of U.S. Air Forces in Europe, it is a tremendous honor to join you this afternoon to celebrate the lives and sacrifices of American airmen who gave their all aboard the American bomber Hot Stuff. Their sacrifice and their commitment to a cause far greater than themselves represents the proud heritage and tradition of honor that is the core identity of today's U.S. Air Force. It is every airman's duty to serve their country in the way the Hot Stuff crew did. Captain Shine Shannon and his men served over the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, conducting anti-submarine patrols. They served in the deserts of Libya, flying bombing missions in North Africa and Italy under incredibly austere conditions. And they served at the many U.S. airfields of England, conducting bombing missions over Europe in an effort to bring our enemies to their knees. During just 10 months of duty, as you've heard, they flew 31 combat missions in their B-24 Liberator. They escaped countless attacks by German fighter aircraft, and they flew through impenetrable walls of flak to ensure mission success. Although the heritage they are responsible for is not well known, it lives on and will be passed on through each of us here right now joining in this celebration. On that faithful mission 75 years ago today, the heroes of the Hot Stuff crew were joined by Lieutenant General Frank Andrews, an airman's airman. A staunch advocate for air power in the Army Air Corps, he was instrumental in the acquisition of the other fabled bomber of World War II, the mighty B-17 Flying Fortress. He was so forceful in his unrelenting support for that airframe that he suffered a demotion for his unremitting advocacy. This gives us an idea of the intestinal fortitude and the character of General Andrews. As a former commander of the mighty 8th Air Force, I am familiar with the thoughts, the words, and the history of men like Ira Aker, Carl Spaatz, and of course, Hap Arnold. And had not fate intervened, Frank Andrews' name would have been even more revered to the level of Dwight Eisenhower. But sadly, his name does not carry the resonance it likely should. But the names of Frank Andrews and the crew and passengers of Hot Stuff do live on and have been raised to the forefront of our minds again through the efforts of Jim Lux and the Hot Stuff organization. This great team has chronicled and heralded the legacy of these amazing airmen so they receive the recognition they so deserve. Their names also live on due to the dedication of the members of the organization of the 93rd Bombardment Group organization, who, like the Hot Stuff team, are committed to keeping heroism alive. I commend you all for your efforts in making today's events possible, and of course, this commemoration would not have happened if not for the caring friendship of our Icelandic hosts. You've been absolutely pivotal in ensuring an enduring monument to the sacrifices made by our American airmen, especially Ali and Dodie Martinson. Thank you so much for your commitment to this proud heritage. And finally, to the family members who are here to commemorate this anniversary today, you represent the honor and the sacrifice that made the crew of Hot Stuff and her passengers so great. Thank you all for allowing me the opportunity to join in this solemn yet celebratory event. The sacrifice and commitment of those who perished on that day lives on in the soul of every modern American service member. And today I want to recognize one of those service members. In fact, I just met her last night, and I'd like to ask her to come up here, is Bethany Dorian. Are you out there? Can you come up here, Bethany? I don't know how many of you have met Bethany. She's a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force. She's a 2017 graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy. And Bethany's great-grandfather was Chaplain Frank Miller. He was on board Hot Stuff. And Bethany, in her first assignment, she's only been in the Air Force for 10 months, right? Well, actually, almost a year. And her first duty station, Andrews Air Force Base, named after Frank Andrews. Is this coincidence? I think not. And we would be remiss if we didn't honor Bethany, because we just dedicated a memorial to a legacy of honor, a legacy of commitment, and a legacy of service. But what you see standing before you, who you see standing before you, is a living legacy. A living legacy that I think bridges the gap between the greatest generation and the newest generation. And I want to give you a coin, Bethany, just to say thank you for first following in your great-grandfather's footsteps, but also for being the service member that will, I know, continue this legacy. Do you think that Chaplain Miller would have ever imagined that he'd have a great-granddaughter graduate from a service academy serving in his footsteps? I don't think so. I know he's proud right now. But ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you to the team that put this together. Thank you to all of our family members that were able to be here right now to celebrate, to our team from the U.S. Embassy, and to all of our Icelandic partners. It was my greatest honor to be here And I stand before you as a humble and grateful servant, and for a grateful nation, I say thank you.
Again, we are touched. Beautiful words and stories. We noticed in the afternoon at the monument the forces of Icelandic nature. The storm, fortunately not the snow blizzard, but that's what it is living in Iceland. And that's maybe what makes us strong. But I think it was good for us to have a little notion of the forces we are dealing with here. Having those forces in mind, let's now go back 75 years.
Are placed under the unified command of Brigadier General Andrews, and he's directing new plans for sky power.
This Air Force will eventually consist of 1,000 planes, organized, trained, and ready for immediate service, and capable of concentrations in any threatened area for the defense of the United States and its possessions.
Before their new commander, the battalions of the Clouds wing in overhead parade. This is Langley Field, Virginia, stationed for the Eastern Wing and commanding headquarters for all three wings of the reorganized Air Force. In these strategic Virginian skies midway along our eastern coast, the myriads of the blue are watched by General Andrews and his staff. And as they wheel in battle formation here at Langley, they are in easy striking distance of New England, Florida, and the Gulf Coast. And on they sweep to the imaginary defense of Uncle Sam's eastern shoreline.
On May 19, 1943, the crew of the B-17 Flying Fortress Memphis Belle was greeted upon returning to England after successfully completing 25 missions over Europe during World War II. They were ordered back to the United States, where they were welcomed as heroes and did an exemplary job of helping sell war bonds and raise morale on the home front. However, there's more to the story. It involves another bomber and a great military leader. It's a story of triumph and tragedy. General Charles P. Cabell of the United States Air Force was the head of General Hap Arnold's Advisory Council at the Pentagon from February 1942 to October 1943. The following is from General Cabell's memoirs, A Man of Intelligence, published in 1997. On 3 May, the day following the Combined Chiefs of Staff meeting, General Marshall called in General Acre just before his departure for the United Kingdom. Marshall requested Acre to carry a message to General Andrews. The message was that Andrews had been selected to command the entire Allied forces that would make the eventual invasion of Europe across the English Channel. General Andrews never received the message. It wasn't until December 1943 the job with the eventual title of Supreme Allied Commander was assigned to General Dwight David Eisenhower.
The story of the B-24 Liberator Hot Stuff and her crew is one of historic triumph and tragedy. During an interview in 2005, General Jacob E. Smart, an aide to General Hap Arnold during World War II, agreed that Hot Stuff and her crew were the first in the 8th Air Force to complete 25 missions, even though the heralded Memphis Belle B-17 Flying Fortress wears the label. Hot Stuff completed 25 missions 3.5 months before the Memphis Belle, but tragedy struck, and she and her crew lost their rightful place in American history. Hot Stuff and her crew were ordered back to the United States to go on tour to help sell war bonds. Lieutenant General Frank M. Andrews, commander of the European Theater of Operations, was ordered to return to Washington, D.C. He contacted his friend, Colonel Ted Timberlake, commander of the 93rd Bombardment Group, and requested to fly back to the States with Captain Robert Shine Shannon in Hot Stuff. Captain Shannon was unaware that General Andrews was bringing members of his staff and others along with him. Bombardier First Lieutenant Robert Jacobson, co-pilot First Lieutenant John Lentz, Sergeants George Farley, Leland Durham, James Craighead, and Grant Rondo were bumped from the airplane to make room for General Andrews' entourage. General Andrews, an experienced pilot, replaced Lieutenant Lentz as co-pilot. Hot Stuff left Bovington Field in England for RAF Prestwick, Scotland, to get the latest weather conditions and refuel before continuing on to Reykjavik, Iceland. It was decided a stop at Prestwick was not necessary, and they continued on to Iceland. On approach to Iceland, Hot Stuff encountered unexpected poor visibility due to snow squalls, clouds, and rain. Captain Shannon made several low passes over Caldedarnes RAF airfield, but decided to continue on to land at Meeks Field near Keflavík. Zero visibility prevented him from landing, so he decided to return to Caldedarnes. But Hot Stuff crashed near the top of 1,100-foot Mount Fagradalsfjall. The tail gunner, Sergeant George Eisel, was the sole survivor of the crash. He received only minor injuries, but one of his legs was caught in the tail section and he couldn't get out. The aircraft caught fire and George thought he was going to burn to death or be killed by exploding ammunition. Heavy rain eventually put the fire out and he was rescued approximately 24 hours after the crash.
CBS World News brings you The World Today, presented Monday through Saturday at this same time. American General Andrews has been killed. The text of a communique announcing the accident said, Lieutenant General Frank Maxwell Andrews, Commanding General of the European Theater of the United States Forces, was killed late today in an airplane accident in an isolated locality of Iceland. Full information confirming the accident is not yet available.
Those killed on board Hot Stuff included pilot Captain Robert Shine Shannon, co-pilot Lieutenant General Frank M. Andrews, who was also the commander of the European Theater of Operations, navigator Captain James E. Gott, radio operator Tech Sergeant Kenneth A. Jeffers, crew chief Master Sergeant Lloyd C. Weir, gunner Staff Sergeant Paul H. McQueen, civilian Adna W. Leonard, Methodist bishop and chairman of the Board of Chaplains, Brigadier General Charles H. Barth, General Andrews' Chief of Staff, Colonel Morrow Crum, he was a member of General Andrews' staff, Colonel Frank L. Miller, U.S. Army Chaplain, Chief of Chaplains, Major Robert H. Humphrey, U.S. Army Chaplain, Lieutenant Colonel Fred A. Chapman, U.S. Army, Major Theodore C. Totten, General Andrews' Secretary, Captain Joseph T. Johnson, General Andrews' aide. 2 memorial services were held in Reykjavik. The first one was held for Tech Sergeant Kenneth Jeffers at the Catholic Church of Christ, Landakot. The second memorial service for the other 13 who were killed in the crash was held at the Domi Kirche Lutheran Church next to the Parliament building in downtown Reykjavik. They were buried in the U.S. military plot in Foskavur Cemetery in Reykjavik on May 8, 1943. In 1947, they were exhumed and returned to the United States. General Andrews is buried in Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia.
In June of 2012, I visited Iceland with the goal of visiting the crash site and recovering pieces of hot stuff wreckage. I was fortunate to find 2 Icelanders who were familiar with the crash site, Dodi and Oli Martinsson. They spend much of their time searching and documenting World War II crash sites in Iceland. The day after I arrived, we were on our way to the crash site near the top of Mount Fagradalsfjall.
Straight ahead, if you look at the sign with the information, the eye,
Right.
And the mountain,
Right behind
that's
it.
the crash site.
How about that? It's that close.
Oh.
We're starting up the mountain to the crash site. It's very difficult climbing. We are here. We're at the crash site. He has a piece of metal right there.
All over the place.
Pieces of the airplane.
First you found on your visit to the crash site.
Wow.
This is just the beginning.
Amazing, huh? This is looking toward Keflavík International Airport. It was Meeks Field during the war. This is where they tried to land at Meeks Field, but couldn't. And we're heading back to Calderdon when they crashed into this mountain. This is part of the main landing gear. The dried up wreath was placed on the landing gear by the United States Ambassador to Iceland, Louis Arriaga, in 2011.
Part of the landing gear that's within the wing structure. That riveting was probably done by women in the United States. And it's a very good job, professional job.
Form a search party and search the rough ground over here. We know of one piece out there which is fairly big, which has some letters, some writing on it that might be interesting.
We're walking in the lava field, looking for pieces of the airplane that might have blown down the mountain. And there's an engine cowling out here somewhere. Dodi located a big piece of wreckage. So did Oli.
P-24, that's D, aircraft number 512G, engine number 4, top.
How about that, huh? Would you turn that around? There we go. On May 3rd, 2013,
the 70th anniversary of the crash of Hot Stuff that took the lives of 14 heroic Americans, a memorial service was held in the Andrews Theater in Keflavík, Iceland. The service included speeches by the President of Iceland, Ólafur Grímsson, and the United States Ambassador to Iceland, Louis Arriaga. Ambassador Arriaga read a message of remembrance from United States Air Force Chief of Staff, General Mark Welch, and letters were read from members of General Andrews' family. A memorial plaque was unveiled beside a highway near Mount Fagradalsfjall, the site of the tragedy. Iceland's President Grímsson stated after seeing this video that every Icelander should see it. After the war, General Andrews was honored when Camp Springs Army Airfield in Maryland was renamed Andrews Field, now Joint Base Andrews, the home of Air Force One. Since then, the accomplishments of this great leader have been nearly forgotten, and the first heavy bomber in the 8th Air Force to complete 25 missions and her crew and those on board who were killed were soon forgotten until now. The purpose of this video is to shed light on the gallant crew of the B-24 Liberator Hot Stuff and their heroic accomplishment, and to revive the legacy of a great American leader, Lieutenant General Frank M. Andrews.
That was something. And with the notion that the weather 75 years ago was similar to what we had today. And I agree with the former president of Iceland, this is something that every people here in Iceland and elsewhere should see. In that film, and today earlier, 2 Icelandic names have been mentioned. It's the brothers, Þorsteinn Marteinsson, don't try to pronounce it. His nickname in Icelandic is Doddi, but in Jim Luck's version is Doddi. So we just call him after that, Doddi. And his bigger brother, Óli. They are very interested in history, not least the history of Second World War. And they have mapped every wreck of aircraft that have crashed in Iceland during the Second World War, and that is their hobby, so to speak. And now, Óli, the older brother, will come to the stage and say a few words. Óli, where are you? Óli, brother.
Dear guests, my name is Ólafur Marteinsson. I will tell you how I became involved in this remembrance memory of Hot Stuff. The year 1960, 5 boys that graduated from Keflavík High School decided to celebrate the graduation by taking a 24-hour hiking trip. We decided to climb the mountain Fagradalsfjall, and on our way through the lava field to the mountain, we noticed a lot of different material mainly aluminum plates, spread over an area near the mountain. At that time, we did not figure out what these metal pieces were or where they came from. Guessed something from outer space. Years passed, and from the year 99, it has been my hobby to travel around the Reykjanes Peninsula, visit rifts and ruins of mountain terraces. On one of my trips, I found a wreck of German military aircraft and added military aircraft crash sites to my interest to visit list. In the summer of 2001, I was alone on my way to visit a ruin of a mountain dairy in Fagridalur, a beautiful valley. It's part of mountain Fagradalsfjall. The scattered metal we found in 1960 came to my mind, and after a short search, I found the area of the scattered metal pieces. As experienced aircraft mechanic, it did not take me a long time to realize that the metal pieces were from aircraft parts, and one of the aluminum panels had a serial number on it. B-24 bomber aircraft that crashed into the mountain on May 3, 1943. A search for information on hot stuff began, and several expeditions were made to the crash site, and the story of hot stuff became more and more interesting. In Texas, USA, was a man named Jim Lux looking for information on hot stuff. He Googled Fagradalsfjall and found my brother's name on the web. An informal team was formed by our group of three to evaluate the possibility of raising a monument in the vicinity of the crash site. Today, we are here to unveil the monument dedicated to Hot Stuff and her crew. To finish this short overview, I will read the Airman Peace Psalm in English and in Icelandic. The English verse: If I climb up into heaven, you are there. If I go to hell, you are there also. If I take the wings of morning and remain in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there also shall your hand lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. The Icelandic issue of the verse. Þótt ég stígi upp í himininn, þú ert þar. Þótt ég gjörði undirheimaða hvílu minni, sjá, þú ert þar. Þótt ég lyfti mér á vængi morgunróðans og settist við ysta haf, einnig þar mundi hönd þín leiða mig og hægri hönd mín halda mér. Takk fyrir.
Thank you, Oli and Dottie. Just to let you know how dedicated the brothers are to this hobby of theirs, so to speak. I think it is 2 or 3 weeks ago that Dottie, the little brother, 60-something, he walked to the crash site. It takes about 3 hours back and forth over the lava and up the mountain, because he was raising a poster with a sign with minimal information on this site. and in 1 week he worked there 4 times. That's Doddy and his brother. I'd also like to tell you that Andrews, his name is on more buildings than this one. Until late 60s, the main sports hall in Reykjavik, that's where our indoor sports was developed, not least the handball. That was a building raised during the Second World War and was always called Andrews until we called it Íþróttahöllin að Háalógalandi. Don't try to pronounce that. Now I call to the stage Colonel E. John Dracon Teichert, Commander of Joint Base Andrews and the U.S. Air Force 11th.
So yesterday on the edge of Washington, D.C., at a place now called Joint Base Andrews, we celebrated our own 75th birthday. On May 2nd, 1943, Camp Springs Army Airfield opened its gates for the first time, training fighter pilots in their missions, amongst which were to escort heavy bombers in the European theater of operations. Of course, the very next day, Hot Stuff crashed here in the rugged hills of Iceland, B-24 Liberator number 41, 23-728. The last words of that crew on that day were continuing. Of course, in reference to continuing along their path in spite of the weather. But back in the middle of 1943, continuing with exactly the spirit that we needed from Americans and allies as they faced the very daunting task during World War II here in the European theater of operations. They needed to continue to prosecute targets on the European mainland. They needed to continue to take the fight to the enemy. They needed to continue to draw up plans for the invasion of the mainland. And indeed, on that day, they continued, and 14 of the 15 crew members and passengers died on that day. Almost immediately, clamoring went forth in Washington, D.C. to rename Camp Springs Army Airfield. And indeed, on March 31st, 1945, it was named Andrews Field, later Andrews Air Force Base, and now Joint Base Andrews. And of course, that base, Joint Base Andrews, is an amazing and enduring memorial to Lieutenant General Andrews, an incredible warrior, officer, leader, and air power advocate, and of course to his family as well. But I want you to consider Joint Base Andrews an enduring memorial and monument for more than just General Andrews. I want you to consider it an enduring memorial for all of the crew who perished on Hot Stuff on that day 75 years ago today, and all of those brave Americans who flew her 31 missions over the contested skies of Europe. I also want you to consider Joint Base Andrews an enduring memorial for those brave Americans that were part of the 330th Bombardment Squadron and the 93rd Bombardment Group, who so bravely flew over 8,100 missions over Europe, dropped 19,000 pounds of bombs, and had an attrition rate greater than 25%. I also want you to consider Joint Base Andrews an enduring memorial and monument for all of those brave Americans and allies that fought here in the 8th Air Force, in the European theater of operations, who made sure that they continued throughout the war to make sure that the cause of freedom prevailed. And so all of you here today, those that were members or family members of Hot Stuff or the 330th or the 93rd, or those that have a legacy of fighting during World War II, when you think of Joint Base Andrews, I want you to remember that it is a monument and a memorial for you. And as you see our president come to or through our base, as he did 184 times last year, think of your enduring monument. As you see a foreign head of state come to or through Joint Base Andrews, as they did 91 times last year, I want you to think of your enduring monument. As you hear about F-16 scrambling to protect our nation's capital, that is from your enduring monument. As you hear about 2,500 wounded warriors setting foot back on American soil for the first time at Joint Base Andrews, as they did 2,500 times last year, I want you to think of your enduring monument. And as we, every single day, the 17 or so thousand members of Joint Base Andrews, go about projecting air power and diplomacy from a place nicknamed America's Airfield, but of course, formerly known as Joint Base Andrews, I want you to remember your part in that enduring monument. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant, for your inspiring speech. You mentioned the word freedom, and that's what it's all about. We've now been sitting here for about 70 minutes, so ladies and gentlemen, please stand up, stretch your hands, hello, and say, turn to your right or left and say, how are you doing to the one that's next to you? Thank you very much. Have a seat, please. So, everyone awake? Then we will have next, well, we are coming close to the end, Mr. James Root, the president of the 93rd Bombardment Group Association. Mr. James Root, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Jim Root, and I am proud to be the president of the 93rd Bomb Group Association. My father was Kenneth Weeks Root Jr., the ranking engineering officer of the 93rd Bomb Group. He was responsible for all the ground crews which maintained and supplied all the B-24s, the artillery equipment, the bombs, vehicles, and the base facilities. The ground crews did remarkable work every night to prepare the bombers for their missions every day. Each of the 60-plus B-24s in the bomb group over the 2.5 years were very personal to him, as he referred to them as his babies in the daily letters he wrote to my mom. The 93rd Bomb Group was made up of 4 squadrons, of which Hot Stuff was part of the 330th. Home was Hardwick Aerodrome 104 in England for almost 2.5 years. The bomb group was known as Ted's Traveling Circus, named after General Ted Timberlake, the commanding officer. I'm extremely honored today to represent all of the veterans, family members, and friends of the current day 93rd Bomb Group Association. Many are here today. Our mission is to carry on the traditions and memories of the 93rd Bomb Group after the veterans of the war have deceased. We have a very strong and active membership, including 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and even 5th generation members now. And we are excited to support the efforts to memorialize General Andrews and all of the crew of Hot Stuff on the 75th anniversary of the crash. My father wrote letters to my mom almost daily, which I have preserved and published in a book titled V-Mail 1017 Days, the time he was over there. On Tuesday, April 27th, 1943, 6 days before the crash, my father wrote in a letter to my mom, in part as follows: Dearest darling, oh, this has been a great day indeed. First of all, I took a nice bath, put on clean clothes, blouse, pinks, and new shoes, and got all set to welcome the big general of the European Theater of Operations, General Andrews. He spent some time with us while we were in Africa, and so he was a special guest and a very interesting officer. Everyone dressed up and had a big reception for him, and the whole field was very neat and clean. On May 6th, 1943, my father wrote in a letter to my mom, Dearest Helen, I reckon I'm about the luckiest of all to have such a grand girl for a wife. You no doubt have read of the tragic plane crash in Iceland which killed General Andrews and crew. It was a heavy loss to all of us over here, and especially this group. Love, Ken. So congratulations to everyone who worked hard over the years to support the effort to honor Hot Stuff and General Andrews with this beautiful monument we dedicated today. It will last forever. And as we say in the 93rd Bomb Group Association, they are fallen but not forgotten. I especially want to add a tremendous thank you to Bill Gross, who you saw in the films. He grew up near Cooperstown, New York, where my dad grew up, and knew my father and our family very well. So it's an honor to know him as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, James. I have met a lot of people in my life. Some of them are lazy, others are very powerful and dedicated. I think no one of all those I met in my 60-something years are as powerful and dedicated as Jim Lux. Without, yeah, I think we should give special applause. As we all know, to create a day like this and do everything that has been done here today, it demands a lot of power and dedication, letters, collecting money, sending emails, thousands of them, and so on and so forth. And it's the question of believing in what you are doing. And that's what Jim Lux has done, and therefore it's my privilege to present him here to this day. Jim, the floor is yours.
For my grandpa glasses, but I'm a little older than I think. I don't know. This has really been a long and wonderful journey for me. It began in 1997 when my friend Robert Jake Jacobson gave me a tiny photograph that I have in my bag that I wanted to show, but it's just a little photograph that he showed me. It was of his bomber, Hot Stuff, but I didn't pay much attention to it. I organized air shows for many years, featuring mostly World War II bombers. And I knew that Jake had flown 31 missions over Europe in B-24 bombers during the war, and invited him to attend as a special guest at the air show. He gave me this photo and to include in a program. And I gave it to my wife, and she used it as part of the program. And when I went to return it to him, he told me I could keep it. Let's see, I got off track here. In 2009, Jake asked me to look up the history of the 93rd Bomb Group on the internet. And I found the website of the 93rd. And I soon discovered that a bomber called Hot Stuff was the first to complete 25 missions in the 8th Air Force. And it rang a bell. I thought it was the Memphis Bell. So I called Jake and I asked him why he hadn't told me the story, that the fact that his bomber was the first to have completed 25 missions. He told me that Hot Stuff was ordered back to the United States, but he and several crew members were bumped from the flight to make room for the general and his staff. A general. He didn't tell me what general. The plane ran into bad weather, crashed, and all on board except one crew member, the tail gunner, were killed. Hot Stuff, by the way, as I mentioned earlier, actually completed 31 missions. That was the first one to do that as well. But 2 weeks after the accident, another bomber completed 25 missions, was sent home and feted to do as the first to do so, and Hot Stuff was soon forgotten. I decided to do some research and try to get proper recognition for Hot Stuff and her crew. I soon learned this great military leader was Lieutenant General Frank Andrews, whom I had never heard of. He was the general that was killed on board Hot Stuff, and I was really disturbed that I had never heard of him because I spent 5 years in the United States Air Force. I learned he was considered one of the fathers of the modern Air Force. I also learned that he was considered one of the, he was head of the GHQ, called General Headquarters Air Force. And he proved his organizational and management skills by organizing and centralizing the Air Force much in the way it is today. He was the only 3 theaters of operations commander in World War II. And that also I found very interesting. And according to General Aker, was to be informed on the day he died that he would be selected as what would eventually be Supreme Allied Commander. That assignment, as already been discussed, was given to General Eisenhower 7 months later. President Reagan once said, "A great leader surrounds himself with smarter people than he or she is." I'm not sure this was the case with General Andrews, but he had a very capable staff, including his Assistant Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Charles Barth. Barth attended Princeton University at age 15. He went on to attend West Point Military Academy, where in 1925 he graduated #1 in his class. He went on to receive an engineering degree from Cornell University, and as a member of the Army Corps of Engineers, was managing the installation of a 3rd set of locks at the Panama Canal, and was also the Director of Civil Defense for the Panama Canal area. General Andrews met him when he was in the Caribbean Defense Command and sent for him when he became Commander of the U.S. Army Forces in the Middle East. Barth was Andrews' Chief of Staff and was promoted to Brigadier General at age 39. He had survived, had he survived, who knows what level of staff officer he might have attained. Some of the passengers who died on board included Major Theodore Totman, who was not only a member of General Andrews' staff, but also his confidant. According to Andrews' deputy commander, Major General Harry C. Ingalls, he was probably the only member of General Andrews' staff who knew the details of his plans for the air war and eventual invasion of Europe. Colonel Morrow Crum, Andrews' public relations officer, worked well with war correspondence personnel and became a close friend of Walter Cronkite, who was later to become a respected national television newscaster. President Roosevelt requested his personal friend, Bishop Abner W. Leonard, chairman of the General Commission of Army and Navy Chaplains, to tour the American bases in Europe. Lieutenant Colonel Fred Chapman, and Army Chief of Chaplains, and Chaplain Major Robert Humphrey accompanied him. They had the challenge of providing the religious needs and help improve morale of troops that at the time when the Air Force was experiencing heavy losses. Bishop Leonard was the head of the Board of Regents at the University of Southern California in the 1920s and saved the university by raising funds needed to keep the institution from closing its doors. Can you imagine what the world would be without Star Wars, E.T., and John Wayne? Captain Robert Chine Shannon was Hot Stuff's pilot, and according to General Ted Timberlake, commander of the 93rd Bombardment Group, he and his crew were the best under his command. When most bombers on patrol spotted an enemy fighter, most ran for home. But Shine's Hot Stuff once spotted an enemy fighter in the clouds, bounced it, and chased it home. After that, Hot Stuff was jokingly known as a P-24 instead of a B-24. The lucky Hot Stuff crew members were co-pilots Captain John Lennis, Bombardier First Lieutenant Jake Jacobson, Sergeants Grant Rondo, George Farley, and James Craighead, who were bumped from the flight. But the luckiest of them all was tail gunner Sergeant George Eisel. He was not only the sole survivor of the crash, but he had survived the crash of another B-24 when it was shot down on a mission over North Africa only a few months earlier. Iceland may be one of the reasons Hot Stuff survived 31 missions. He is credited with shooting down 6 enemy aircraft and would have had many more to his credit had he been able to watch them hit the ground. According to Bill Gross, who welcomed everybody here today in a video at the beginning of the memorial service, Isel had poor eyesight. The luckiest people here today, however, are members of Hot Stuff's engineer, gunner, Sergeant Grant Rondo's family. They would not be with us if Rondo had not been replaced on the flight by Hot Stuff's crew chief, Lloyd Weir. So they're all here today because he managed not to be on that airplane. And I think it's great that they're here. These men represented more than 100,000 American airmen who fought in the skies over Europe in World War II. More than 26,000 airmen were killed in the 8th Air Force. That's more than the total Marines that lost their lives in World War II. There was only 1 chance in 5 of surviving 25 missions, and Hot Stuff had already completed more than 25 before the mission limit was put in place. These brave young men knew there was little chance they would survive the war as they watched their fellow airmen being shot out of the sky, or when they returned all the empty bunks in the barracks that night after a mission. The monument will be a lasting memory to the crew of Hot Stuff, passengers who were on board, and a testament to their commitment to duty, honor, country. To my friends, Dottie and Ole Martinson, thank you for coming up with the idea of the monument. To honor these brave men. To the people of Iceland, and especially the people of Keflavík, I cannot thank you enough for providing the land for the monument, the wonderful hospitality and support I have received. Thank you.
Well, you understood, Jim, what you were saying. Thank you. Thank you so much. May I ask you please to come up here? Now there's just one on the agenda he doesn't know about. Yeah, got you. Please stand here, and may I ask Mr. Þorsteinn Guðnason to come up here. Do you know Mr. Þorsteinn?
I'm not sure.
No, you have never met him.
I have a great memory, just short.
Okay. Now I'll tell you why Þorsteinn is here and you are here. About 2 months ago, myself and Dottie, we were interviewed by a journalist from Morgunblaðið, one of our widespread newspapers. And we were telling the journalist about this day and about Andrews. A couple of days later, Mr. Þorsteinn Guðnason, who lives in Reykjavík, he phoned me and told me that he had been at the crash site in 1969 or 1970. And he found one piece there called Silver Wing. And this was on the crash site, and he found it in 1969, 1970, somewhere there around. And he asked, don't you guys want to take it? I said, of course, but who should take it? And do not we all agree that there is only one person that should accept it and put it in the right place. And that's Jim Lux. Now it's my pleasure to present gentlemen. They are just on their daily outfit. It's Karlakór Keflavíkur. It's the men choir of Keflavík. Hey guys, come on the stage and they will sing 2 songs for us. The conductor, sorry. The conductor is Jóhann Smári.
You have to experiment a bit with the light so they see the music. If it were a female chorus, they would know the text. This is my son, Sarah Helgi, on piano, and I demand that he sees me.
Guess everyone knew the first song. We thank Keflavíkur very much, and the conductor Jóhann Smári Sævarsson. The first song should be familiar to all here. The second was, of course, in Icelandic, and it's about missing, as you maybe noticed from the feeling or the emotions in the song and the lyric. And we will have here on stage George Young from the 93rd Bombardment Group Association, and he will now read High Flight, a poem by John Gillespie McGee Jr.
Thank you. As was mentioned, this poem, High Flight, was written by John Gillespie McGee Jr. when he was 19 years old. He was born of an American father and a British mother, and he enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force at the outset of the war and was trained to fly Spitfires and was received his wings and promoted to pilot officer. So Officer McGee wrote this poem at 19, just a few short months before he was tragically killed in a mid-air collision over Europe, over England. I know this is a poem that has been taken to heart by many aviators, and mostly military aviators. So, and it's very famous, so you may have heard it, at least parts of it, but I'd like to recite it for you now. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds, and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through the footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God.
Thank you, George. Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming to an end. Please stand for retirement of callers. But there is some misunderstanding. But it's good to stand up, isn't it? So, we'd like to thank you all for coming here. All those who have prepared this day. And especially we would like to thank the music people and the Winds Aloft band that will play here by the end. Jim, you have some announcement to make, and then you will close the ceremony.
There are two buses out front, and they will be taking people to see the B-52 bomber. And I'd like to invite the people who have the tags on that are in the tour group, if they would be the first to board the buses, not their original buses, but the buses that are going to the B-52. And the bus will return to take others to the B-52 as well. So I thank you so much for being a part of this. You just didn't come to observe. You are a part of this day, and thank you so much.